Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. So today we're going to explore the implications of BS 476, or what's referred to as the national standard, being removed from building control approved document B. Just before we start, our minds and thoughts are with the Turkey and Syria, with the terrible earthquake tragedy there, and families that have lost their loved ones, and rescue workers risking their lives, and also with firefighters. We remember Michael Miller and Jeff Waterman of Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service, who tragically lost their lives trying to rescue occupants on a 15th floor flat. So just to start with, today's webinar will be around 45 minutes with a Q&A session, which has proved very popular on previous webinars. Please be free to use the chat facility on the Zoom link there at the bottom of your screen. We will try and answer as many questions as we can, and we'll try and keep the webinar moving so we get ample opportunity.
Good afternoon, everyone. So just to cover a few house rules, the views and opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Rutland Trading Company Limited. Decisions should not be made based on the content of this webinar without taking additional independent legal and professional advice. And please note that BS 476 has not been removed from the approved document at this time. The UK government is inviting feedback through open consultation until the 31st of March 2023.
Thank you, Ben. We're just going to be talking quite a bit about different standards and terminology. So just run through, when we say national standard, we're talking of BS 476. When we say European standard, EN 1634. A lot of you will be familiar with these, but just in case anyone isn't, ADB is approved document B, and VLUC is replaced the MHCLG, and then there's the national classes. When we refer to that, it's British standards. Ben, did you want to just go over the learning?
Yeah, so today we'll be looking at a few learning objectives. What basically may lie behind this major move, the history of the BS 476 and the BS EN 1634 standards. Why might the government be suggesting this change? That's an important one for us all to review. The implications of this change, and ultimately the key areas to watch in our opinion. So hopefully this webinar will cover all those points and everyone will have some thoughts to take away today.
Thank you, Ben. So just to introduce today's panel, we're excited about our panel today. We've got Chris Waterman, who's Public Policy Advisor to the House of Lords, Jerry Quayle, who's an independent specialist consultant in passive fire with a lot of experience, and Richard Day, this chair of the ACDM, Russell Day, sorry, apologies, Russell, and Richard Kowalski of Stairways Midland Group. So please take advantage of, hope you learn a lot today. So I'll just hand over now to Chris. Thank you for joining, Chris.
Hello, good afternoon. Morning.
You're muted, Chris, I think.
I normally make more sense when I'm muted, but thank you for this invitation.
Good morning.
And I'd like to echo one of the earlier slides that anything I say is not the official policy, and I'm an advisor to some of the House of Lords, not the House of Lords, mainly the opposition, and I do a similar job in the House of Commons. So, and basically, I got involved in legislation many years ago, but I've taken a particular interest in the Building Safety Act, particularly following reading the Hackett report after Grenfell. and I'm now working specifically on getting people out of buildings in the event of fire. Now, Barbara Hackett talked about a golden thread, and I did some research, and I thought that the golden thread looked, a bit like this. And I thought that all you had to do was to sort of untangle it. I then began to look a bit more deeply into what was happening. And in fact, I discovered that the golden thread in reality is a bit more like this. Different colors, different strands, plenty of knots, some entanglement. And in fact, the golden thread is not a distant dream, but it's going to take a huge amount of work to get it in place. The other thing that I have, and I'm not going to have any light bulb moments today, I don't think, but I hope some of you might. So I'll just turn this off, or in fact, I'll throw it on the floor. But what I'm interested in is simplifying what happens and trying to build a bridge between the policymakers, and there are policymakers, there are politicians who use the policy, and then there are themselves on the front line charged with introducing it. And so my first effort, if I could have my slide up, please. What I've tried to do is, and actually this reads from right to left, which is helpful. The top red box on the extreme left is legislation, and the long pinky box is what we need to do to implement it. And I've split this safer buildings slide into different stages. And you've got the finance providers, the sort of people who are probably going to buy Man United tomorrow. You've got the design concept, and that's where the architects come in. There's then a hiatus while the buildings or the land is bought. And because the shape of the site might vary, or there might be some issues, the architects adjust the concept. And then there's a long negotiation, hopefully not too long, with the planning officers to get planning permission, and then the design is finalized. So the professionals involved at this stage are principally the architects, although they will be taking advice from other groups. Then the second stage is you appoint the developers, they appoint the main contractors, they appoint the subcontractors. The subcontractors appoint the suppliers, and then all of those people got one eye on the regulations. Now, what I bought when I do this job, and I work from home sometimes, and in the Commons or the Laws Annex, I bought a special pair of fire safety glasses. And I think these should be standard issue, even if they're a bit like the ones when you used to go and see 3D movies. They should be standard issue because everybody should be wearing or should have a tinted glass showing that they are aware of the fire safety implications. Now, as soon as a building is built and the snagging is done, then the owners and the residents and I think that's repeated, but the residents and the maintenance people need again to have their own fire safety glasses on. Now, the bits for, it's quite interesting because I spent half a day last week just wandering around with a fire engineer, a couple of tower blocks in a London borough. And what intrigued me was that the people who need to have a particular eye on fire safety and fire doors, of course, are all of the people who are starred along this orange stripe. And that is why they certainly need to have one eye on fire safety. And also, and I didn't realise until I went round the tower blocks, how vital fire doors are. Because if you've not got decent fire doors, then you're nowhere. Now, I think that's about my 9 minutes, and I'm going to stop there. And because I'd far rather answer your questions, tell you things you want to know, rather than me choose things you might want to know, you might not want to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was excellent. And I really enjoyed your fire safety glasses. We'll talk about that later as well. So I'm now going to hand on to Jerry Quayle. Jerry, good morning.
Morning, Jerry.
How are you all?
Yeah, look like you're in a furnace.
That was the idea, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm going to give you a brief history of BS 476 and EN 1634, and hopefully remove some of the issues that are confusing as to the difference between what we currently use, the duality between 476 and 1634, and why certain parameters within that, within the new standard or within European standard, have been taken up. Well, a lot of this is shrouded in history and time and confusion, born out of a willingness not to impart crucial information because it wasn't clear where it came from. But tracing back our use of fire door standards, it actually started way before this first slide that you can see in 1953, BS 476 Part 1, and goes back to just before the start of the Second World War in the UK. Prior to that, in fact, the Americas were using a standard not very dissimilar to the one that we've used here in Part 1. Because they recognized the fact that there was an issue related to fire doors. And we actually started with it in commercial buildings and hotels and premises of that type. 476 started, as you can see here, from a negative pressure performance, in that it was dragging the air in from all across the face of the door into the furnace and feeding the furnace in that way. The idea here was that, in fact, the furnace had, or the heating conditions where the furnace is, had a chimney. So all the air was being taken out of the room by the heat of the fire, typically because everyone had fireplaces in their buildings, maybe several in one building. Therefore, the chimney effect occurred. Now, that only covered that scenario. So as the interested bodies started to work and review what they were saying and how testing was done, they decided that, in fact, there was a case where there was no chimney, and therefore we needed to have a positive pressure test. Back in 72, this became Part 7, and then later in 87, Part 22. And as you can see from this slide, the idea was that as there was no chimney, everything was being forced against the door in terms of hot gases, However, they recognized the fact that air would be drawn underneath the door to feed the fire in this closed scenario. And bearing in mind, these tests are carried out on a 3x3 furnace, which is about a meter or so deep. Doesn't really represent very much of a room, but what it does represent is a way of categorizing doors, and in this case doors, but in any construction material, to differentiate between good performers and bad performers with a line drawn in the sand. There is an argument that indeed the curve used on this, which is ISO 834, is not representative of a real building fire, because it has inexhaustible supplies of energy. So we established this neutral pressure plane, and we've continued to use that for 40 odd years, getting on for. And very successfully, we've tested huge numbers of doors, vast quantity of product, moving away from doors, partitions, a whole raft of product has been tested against this regime with great success. And we used in this test a very responsive thermocouple system, which is basically a wire, which has been used extensively around the world for a variety of other test regimes. Now, the Europeans decided that they wanted to have their own test, and that we should be complying with them. And I won't go into the politics surrounding that. So extensive research was undertaken theoretically, and they decided to use the ISO 834 curve, which continues to be in place. So heating regimes are exactly the same. As you can see there, the difference in this test is minimal, and the neutral pressure plane, they moved to 500. The reason for that is very detrimental to fire doors, but holds no scientific basis that I can find as to why they would want to move this down. Indeed, they decided that there was a case to answer to use a different thermal recording mechanism. So the thermocouples were changed to these plate thermocouples. They work very well for non-combustible materials, but for combustible materials, they have a negative effect. And indeed, some of you will be aware of the fact that there is almost a reduction or a slowness for these plate thermocouples to actually reach the recorded temperature from within the furnace. And that really causes doors, in our case, to be tested for longer than they would have been had it have been a wire thermocouple. So there are significant differences between them, which are lost in the eons of time as to why the replacement of the EN1634 and the way the furnace runs has been done. Everything else, by the way, stays virtually the same. So the thermal throughput through the test sample remains the same. The gaps remain the same, etc., etc. So there is only this internal difference. Now, if we're going to use this, replace BS476 in the national psyche with EN1634 on the basis that it makes a better performing product. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that for a few decades now, the Europeans have been using this standard, and you see this wonderful graph, a wonderful global image produced by the World Health Authority. The areas in black or in grey are not significantly high numbers of deaths per 100,000, but you will see, interestingly, that the Scandinavians, the Greeks, the Belgians, and indeed France kills more people per 100,000 than we do in the UK, which is very interesting. we've ignored the places that are not Western world in this because they're catastrophic, and that may be due to other factors associated with things like the response of the fire and rescue services, whereas in the Western world, they're very much quicker, or the developed world. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that, in fact, what we have in the UK and in Europe is a descending death rate. Death rate from fires and burns 1990 to 2019 for these 5 countries represented the European theatre of operations. So you can see back in 1990, we killed quite a lot of people in fires per 100,000, but this has gradually been going down in all countries. And indeed, you'll see that we actually had a slight blip 2017, and we all know why that was. However, we are below all the countries that have been using EN 1634 for a long period of time. I can only deduce that if we're using BS 476 as our yardstick with which to measure, we are better than an EN 1634 environment. Happy to answer questions at the end of this session. So over to you, Neil.
Thanks very much, Jerry. We appreciate you've had a lot of experience in test labs, and it's good to get that opinion and feedback. We just wanted to remind attendees to use the chat function. So the Q&A will be very good if we get all your questions through. There's bound to be hundreds of other people that want to ask the same question. So just a reminder there. And I now hand over to Russell Day. Russell, good morning.
That's who I am. Association of Composite Door Manufacturers. We were formed in 2002 with the intention of developing composite doors into the UK market. Initially as non-fire doors, but then fire doors became a product in the mid-2000s. Let's take it on from there. So one of our issues when we're looking at changing over to EN 1634 Part 1 as our fire resistance testing and 1634 Part 3 for our smoke control is that there currently is no EXAP, extended application standard, for composite fire doors. I mean, this is so important because 1634 Part 1 testing results are of no use until they are classified through EN 13501 Part 2. And EN 13501 Part 2 also provides a field of application for the product. As many are aware that most fire resistant products need an assessment of some sort to extend the application of the results of fire testing. If they don't have that assessment taken produced, the results are only applicable to a door, for example, of exactly the same specification and size as that one tested. So to meet the market, we would end up testing thousands of doors simply to get the scope that we needed. So the assessment, although it, following Grenfell, the term assessment, and particularly global assessments that we used to use, became quite a toxic term. And therefore, we tend not to use that anymore. And we talk about a field of application, which is a term used within the 13501 Part 2. So currently, due to the construction products regulations, any fire door fitted as an external fire door falls within the scope of EN 14351 Part 1, and therefore will be subject to the legal requirements of the construction products regulations, which means that there needs to be a declaration of performance, and the product needs to be either UK CA marked, as we can do now, or originally CE marked. However, for an internal application, The standard for that, which is EN 14351 Part 2, although published in 2018, was not cited within the official journal of the European Union, and therefore the construction products regulations do not apply to internal fire doors, and therefore no declaration of performance or UKCA marking or CE marking is required. So if we do go down the route of a 1634 testing and EN 13501 Part 2 classification for composite fire doors, because we don't have that extended application yet, the only extension of scope within the testing would be from the direct applications within EN 1634 Part 1. So it becomes very limiting. A typical example was that one of our members had a full scope written for their external fire doors. They had a request for the door letter plate to be removed. So in other words, not cutting a hole in the door. And they couldn't do that without another full test, because the DIAPs within 1634 Part 1 do not allow that to happen. Whereas within an extended application, which we're in the process of writing at the moment, that would be allowed, because you're actually making the door less vulnerable by not cutting a hole in it. But that's a typical example of what we are. So tests to demonstrate the performance of the assessments. So all assessments, even the old global assessments, were based on test evidence. They were not what became known as a desktop study, where people were using their opinions, not looking at direct test evidence. Whereas, as I say, all of the global assessments were based on direct test evidence, but using the abilities, the knowledge, the experience of fire engineers within the test labs to increase the scope of those tests. So if we look at the next slide, so all performance evidence would be based on 1634, yeah, with that 13501 Part 2 test report. 13501 test report, that includes a field of application, as I've said, based on DIAPs and XAPs. The problem with that is that once that report is issued, any national field of application based on 476 testing would be invalid. They would be withdrawn. So we will reduce the scope of use of internal fire doors simply because we're withdrawing what is a field of application developed by fire engineers. The field of application will be very limited for composite doors. Timber door sets obviously have a full XAP available. So once the testing's done and a classification report is produced, the XAPs there will be fine in terms of giving the scopes that are needed. We will have an XAP hopefully available and published within the next 2 years. So for us, should 476 be removed from document B, it's really about the timing. So providing we have sufficient transition period so that that XAP is published, then we can go forward. And we're talking here about developing new products. You know, the development life cycle of a product, you know, can be 5 to 10 years in some cases, but certainly 5 years would be a reasonable level of transition period for us. Existing certification schemes, as I said, would be withdrawn because they can't have, we can't have two fields of application, one based on 13501 Part 2 and one as a 476 based certification scheme. A field of application would become the basis of that certification based on the 13501 Part 2 classification report. So what effect, what are the disadvantages? Well, the first one, of course, is cost. It would be excessive. I know the cost analysis issued with the consultation talks about the cost of manufacturers of about £9 million over 10 years. Well, the first thing is, unless they give us a 10-year transition period, that £9 million would be condensed into maybe 2 or 3 years at best. But we equally have to look and say, is £9 million a reasonable amount? I know, for example, that just one of my members have spent nearly £500,000 getting their testing and certification through for the 476 based door. So, you know, that's just one manufacturer. So £9 million does seem very low, and given that's the whole of the product range rather than just doors. So we need extensive testing database. We become redundant. So we have over 40 years worth of test data in 476 test results. 1987 was when part 22 came out. So even there we are 35 odd years. So we have all of that test data that really is just going to be thrown in the bin. And we've seen that 476 testing has shown a significant reduction in deaths in the UK. There's no evidence to show that 476 is not robust, and indeed, as we've said, the history of deaths in the UK from fire actually show that it is a robust system. But when we look at one of the parts of this consultation is the removal of Class O within, and they put that within the 476 series. In fact, Class O doesn't appear in BS 476. It's a class that's been developed by combining two separate tests standards within 476, and the only place it appears actually is within the approved document B. So I can understand why they're trying to remove Class O, but why throw everything out just to get one, the removal of one class that was invented by predecessors of DLUHC. So there are some advantages. We would achieve consistency in assessing fire rating performance. One of the issues that Judith Hackett came out with was that there's a lot of confusion in terms of approved document B, and this is just one of them, the fact that we have two methods of complying to a single requirement. So, you know, one can see that would clarify things for them. I mean, the Office of Product Safety and Standards are looking at ways to demonstrate fire performance for internal fire doors for legislative purposes. Obviously, having a single standard to which fire doors have got to be tested would be advantageous for them going forward. And the other one is, of course, it could potentially stop the practice of fire doors being assembled on site from various components from various suppliers. These doors obviously have absolutely no test evidence and no classifications to show their performance. So on that basis, really that practice would need to stop on site, which would change site practice quite considerably. And I think that's the end of my bit from the ACDM. Thank you for listening.
No, thank you. Very valid points and very balanced view of the situation. Thank you. I'm glad you referred to both timber and composite in there. We are also thinking of steel fire door manufacturers too. So, thank you. Now I'm going to pass over to Richard. Richard, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Richard Quayle from Stairways, technical manager. What I'll be talking about is the effects on BS 8214 and possibly other standards. 8214, just a quick one if you don't know what 8214 is. 8214 goes into details on fire doors, but the main element that I use it for and the industry uses it for is how to install a fire door. Installation of fire doors is a massive hot topic at the moment. Probably the main question I personally get asked on a daily basis. But it's a standard that is very, it's not used at all. Nobody knows about it. People have never heard of it, but it is referred to on most, if not all, fire certificates. So when you look at any fire certificate, generally, like it says, if not all of them, will say refer to BS 8214 for installation. So that's a quick information on that document. If removal of 476 does come in, it won't massively or really greatly affect 8214. Like many standards, it does actually just say you can use products that have been tested to 476 or 1634, and a lot of other standards also they do say you can use one standard or the other, or refer to one standard or the other. So regarding 8214, there will be no major issue apart from having to retest products that have been tested to 476. What I'll also just move on to at the moment is we've talked about fire testing today. Something that I think we've missed, which I'll just bring up as well, is the actual note from the government says all 476 and the series. So that's any part within 476. So that also includes smoke certification and smoke testing as well. So any manufacturer that has tested their smoke to part 31 will have to retest the smoke certification as well as any fire door that you've tested to 476 as well. You would have to retest and get your global assessments and everything like that as well. For me, my opinion on a lot of this is I'm all for fire safety. I think fire safety is paramount. I'm a big advocate of fire safety, but if we do go through with this change, it needs to be implemented correctly. The suggested 12-month transition period is not possible at all. You are thinking, like the gentleman said a moment ago, 5 years as a minimum for the transition period. Test houses can only cope at the minute with their workload, but implementing something like this will absolutely cripple the industry, the test lab industry, and everything like that. And there's so many things that are associated with these standards. It is quite shocking. So yeah, thank you very much. Mine was quite a quick one because we are running low on time, and like the first gentleman said, it's always good to get questions and answers rather than listen to us waffle on too much. So thank you very much. I'll hand you back to Russell.
Thank you, Richard. That's very key what you say about implementation and cost, so thanks for bringing that in. Can I just ask you, when the multiple references to both BS 476 and EN 1634 in all these multiple documents, how do you see them all being removed at the same time?
The only thing they can, it's one of them weird things where, in essence, all documents will have to be revised to remove the reference to 476. It won't all be done. It'll just be done slowly, and they'll probably add a note or an additional document or something like that. But it's the same as everything. There's a lot of alterations that will need to be done throughout the all of the documents. And to put it in perspective about altering documents and things like that, something I forgot to mention was yesterday I spent 15-20 minutes looking through all the certified certificates for the timber door industry, and every single certified certificate that I could find, and somebody will probably correct me on it because there's probably one out there that doesn't say this, are all certificated to 476. Not a single door certificate is covered under 1634. So you would have to revise and update and amend every single certifier. So just for the viewers that don't know what certifier is one of the largest third-party certification schemes available, and they provide a great service for third-party certification. A lot of us are members of the scheme, but like I said, there's a lot of work that would need to be done to alter everybody's certificate documentation and everything like that. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Great point. Right, I'll just wanted to get a bit of experience from Scandinavia and Europe. And Ben, you've travelled a lot in Europe and Scandinavia. Just tell us a bit what you've found with fire doors, just generally.
Yeah, sure. So generally in the Scandinavian market, what I recognised was that a lot of people live in apartment type buildings, typically of a modern design, and presuming they're modern, these doors will already be tested to the BS-EN 1634 standards. In the UK, where we differ is that we have many more heritage style buildings, which typically would have a range of customised door dimensions where they would require a fire rated application. They then have to stay within the appropriate door dimensions and the various thicknesses of 46mm or 44mm or for 30 minutes and 54mm for 60 minutes. Whereas in the Scandinavian market, what's quite clear is that a lot of the doors are a more standardized dimension, typically a thicker door thickness as well. And there's a mix of wood and also metal doors. But one of the things that's quite interesting that you definitely notice is of the doors that you're typically going into in the buildings, they're typically opening outwards. So when you go up to an entrance door that may be a fire-rated door and also a apartment entry door, you typically pull the door towards you to open it. There's an element of theory that this allows people that are living in apartment buildings to have a feeling of spaciousness within their rooms. And ultimately, the focus is the clearer, safer way to exit a building should you need to escape in the event of a fire. And there was unfortunately a tragedy in the 19th century in Finland where in a church, a alarm went off and a number of people attempted to leave the building. And in the attempt of leaving the building, which at that point was a pull to open door, many people actually got crushed and tragically lost their lives. The unfortunate situation with that was that it was actually a false alarm. So the deaths were actually unnecessary, which was very unfortunate. So there have been things that have been learned along the way in the Scandinavian market. And one of the things was in 2008, the SP, which is the Technical Research Institute of Sweden, which is now known as RISE, basically started a program to fund the review of the current standardizations to improve them and move along. And essentially
So the government funded it?
Yes, the government funded it. They wanted to bring all the Scandinavian countries together to review the current certifications that are currently in place and to allow these doors to be manufactured. But one of the bizarre things about the Scandinavian territory, which is quite different to ourselves, is the climate change is quite different. They have much colder winters. So historically, buildings used to have a two-door entry system. One would be that you would pull the door from the exterior to open the door, thus keeping the heat inside the building. And then the internal door used to then open internally. And that would essentially keep your heat within buildings. But as the materials used within door production has improved and efficiency has improved, doors are now generally a single door entry into a building. But in this case, yes, this is kept the original standard of pull the door to open, because that is most commonly what people are used to. So the door thicknesses that are different though is for a 30-minute door, typically it's a 48mm thickness. And then for a 60-minute door, typically it's 64mm thickness. So there's some quite big differences actually. And the experience in general is that you are generally handling a heavier door in order to enter a building. And this is what I identified.
Right, yeah. And you said about more standardization, like doors.
Yeah, they typically appear to be almost of the same width.
Right, yeah.
And if they've got a tape measure out specifically at that point.
Because of the classification reports, that it's more restrictive.
Yes, I believe this to be correct.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. That's great. Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted to personally say that, I mean, we could take the view that we've always tested to EN standards for door controls and hardware, and kind of take a sort of this doesn't affect us. But that would be, it wouldn't be a right attitude, because as Richard said, a lot of fire doors are based on the British standard, the national standard. So one thing that I am concerned about personally as well is the cost, and the cost to the industry. When we're thinking of enhancing life safety at every fire door, anything that could restrict supply and prohibit supply of fire doors and slow up the installation of fire doors, it wouldn't be a good thing for life safety.
Well, if I can ask you a question now, do you see the removal of the BS 476 standard as actually improving life safety?
I would say that yes and no, because in the sense that the EN standard is more onerous, it makes people think about designing the fire door more to get through that more onerous test. What does concern me is the third-party certification, like UCAS approved third-party certification route, does actually force factory production control visits and a lot of checks with third-party certification. So as long as that is implemented along with it, so there is, it's been said that the BS 476 standard hasn't been reviewed for decades. So hasn't the EN 1154 standard for door closers. It was written in 2000 and published in 1996, amended in 2002, and there's been no subsequent amendments. So as long as the EN standard is equally reviewed. So there are a lot of pros and cons, but anything to improve life safety, we're fully behind.
I have a slide actually where I can just show a few of the changes that have occurred in Scandinavia. So there is a slide which you can see on the screen now. I just chose an example of Denmark. So they used to have an old classification, and they've subsequently moved over to the new classification, which you'll quite commonly recognise with the EI standards on the left. And as you can see, the thickness of the door dimensions appropriating to the right fire ratings are also of a thicker door design as well. But there's an example where Sweden also had a change. So they used to have a national type approval for fire doors, and whilst it wasn't a legal requirement, it was actually an industry standard and guaranteed the approval of the doors to be manufactured to a safe level. But since the 1st of November 2019, it is now obligatory for all fire doors within the European Union to be CE marked. So they've gone through some radical changes in order to advance their fire efficiency and safety.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you. We're just going to have 10 minutes of Q&A. There's over 30 questions come through, so we're not going to be able to answer them all, unfortunately, but we will answer the balance on video and put that on the events page on the Rutland website. So what's the first question you've got there, Ben?
Okay, so the first question, Chris, this one's for yourself, Chris Waterman. This is from Donald Caravan. Given the sunset clause in the recent proposed act of the UK government, will the status of EU standards and guidances be affected after the date of elimination of EU legislation, assuming the act passes? And that's for you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a bit like saying, how long is the golden thread? We are in a situation at the moment where the government is tying itself in knots about what to do with EU regulations. And I noticed there are some other questions further down. We will certainly have a different government within a couple of years. And I just don't think that, my own personal view is that a lot of the EU stuff will just be moved over, partly because, of course, it was British lawyers that drafted most of it. So I don't think we're going to start with a blank sheet of paper on legislation or regulation. I think we will just carry on with what there is. And one other thing is, I've heard a lot about having to change stuff. We're now living in a digital world. So third-party certification, a lot of that can be done at the lowest level on a search and replace on your certificate, perhaps.
Yes.
Just a thought.
Thank you. Did you want to answer one of the other questions further down, Chris, while you're...
Well, only to say that I mean, I went to every committee session on the building safety bill in the Commons and the Lords, and you just never know what could happen and what could influence something.
Yeah.
You know, there was a feeling that Robert Jenrick having sitting next to a developer at a dinner affected a significant piece of legislation. So perhaps you ought to keep an eye on where the politicians are having their supper, because that could be more important than a perfectly logical and balanced argument. But I've been around too long to be less than sceptical.
You referred just now to British lawyers would have had a lot to do with the writing of standards. Since Brexit, do you see a concern that we are not sitting around the table now when EN standards are being revised?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's why Eurostar isn't making the profits it was. We're in Europe. It's all the administrators going to and fro. Things, and another really good example, which is awful, is the fact that you know, we had a European standard for arresting people in other jurisdictions. That is a table we're not at. There are all sorts of bits, as well as the research and development, that British higher education just isn't involved in any longer.
Yeah.
I'm a bit of a Remainer, as you might have understood.
No, I only raise that because if it does impact the way our buildings are built and so on, and we've not got a say in it.
Yeah, and the other thing is, I mean, I spent 2 years working in Stockholm, and the buildings felt much more resistant to the weather.
Yeah.
So they had to be more robust just to keep the cold out. And I think that they were more robust inside as well with heavier doors. Unfortunately for us, our climate is not severe enough to have woken us up to double glazing, triple glazing.
Yeah.
So I think that's why we're in why we're living in some not only very old buildings, but some pretty skimpy, shoddy new buildings.
Thank you, Chris. The next question, Ben.
Okay, so Jerry, this is one for yourself. This is for Jerry from IABLE. The death rate has more variables than the BS 476, surely. I guess that's a question on your global slide.
Oh, absolutely, and I said so at the time that the death rate has reduced graphically over a period of time, and BS 476 isn't the only deciding factor. It is almost impossible to divide the death statistics into data which relates specifically to the performance of construction materials. However, you will see that if you drill down through the death rate, particularly the UK side of the information, you can go through the Home Office statistics. It shows the deaths for smoke, for instance, which is the principal cause of death within a fire. If we're looking at smoke doors as a way of preventing smoke traveling between compartments, and therefore reduces that death rate, then why not conclude that? If you know, lies, damn lies, and statistics, it's very difficult to determine exactly the cause of death. And I mentioned in my discussion the fact that we have a very good fire brigade who turns out and does a sterling job, and Neil alluded to that at the beginning of the presentation. So via 476 and fire compartmentation is only one aspect of fire deaths, but it's the only one that I can readily get hold of on an international scale. It's interesting that we talked about Scandinavia, and you gave us that insight into Scandinavia. In the Americas, the American system is very prescriptive. So all their fire doors are 45mm thick, regardless of whether they're 20 minutes, 45 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, 120 minutes, etc., etc. And the thing that changes there is that they have to change materials because they cannot get performance out of a 45mm thick door. There are some subtle changes to the way that they test their doors, but they're all prescriptive, and they don't allow you to develop a product which performs because it has to comply with the regulation, which is 45mm thick. We did have a second question.
Yeah, I can find it here. If we have a lower death rate, then why is Doc B looking to be replaced? BS 476 is an onerous test based on real world situations. I guess that also relates to your colourful world map.
Yes, BS 476 in various guises is used around the world. For instance, a lot of ex-Commonwealth countries remove the word BS and stick their own nomenclature on the front of it. Yeah. Or call it something else, but it is basically a rewrite of the same document. It's a line in the sand. It's clearly a line in the sand. And if you look very carefully at the data that's come, at the images that come out, particularly in populist media, LinkedIn being a prime example of that, you will see, oh, these doors stop the fire progressing, aren't they wonderful? When you look at the doors, they weren't as burnt as they would have been in a fire test, for example. Yeah. And I do an awful lot of heritage work, for instance, and here you're looking at the fact that fires don't behave like they do in a fire test. Completely different scenarios, and are much less onerous than you would expect them to be given the way that fire testing is done. So it's a line in the sand. 1634 is another line in the sand, a different line in the sand. It's not the same line, it's slightly different. Let's say it's a slightly slanted line rather than a straight line, and it's not necessarily in front of ours or behind it, it's just different. And if you're measuring different things, items perform in a different way.
And yeah, that's good, Jerry. Just while you're on the screen there, there's a question come through. If we do switch to EN 1634, will that invalidate the certification of all fire doors previously installed under BS 476 standards?
No, it's not retrospective. So it would be new build going forward. It cannot be retrospective. It will alter the sort of work that I do in heritage buildings, but because that's prediction rather than testing. But no, it won't. It's not retrospective. It will go forward. The other question that we had was, will we need to test from both sides? Again, it's going to be down to debate and discussion, and who needs and who is going to decide that. We did demonstrate after the infamous 2017 event that if you test timber fire doors from both sides, there isn't the way that we've always tested them was always described as most onerous, and that testing demonstrated that we were right, that it was more onerous, and that testing them from both sides was not required on timber fire door sets, on timber doors and timber leaves and timber frames.
Thank you, Jerry.
Excellent. Russell, we have a couple of questions for yourself as well. And someone says, are you aware that the BS 8214 is about to undergo a major update?
Yes, indeed. On Monday, we had the initial doodle poll to determine a kickoff meeting for that. So 8214, yes, is ready to undergo its review. One of the big changes will be, at the moment, it's for timber doors. So it's only the intention is to change that to be for all fire door sets, and with annexes for any specifics that may relate to timber or composites or metal fire doors. So yes, that is being reviewed, but the length of time it will take, yeah, it will take a while. And let's face it, a lot of us are still waiting for the final report from the Grenfell inquiry to see what that comes up with and whether or not that's going to affect. You know, removal of 476 from approved document B will entail the rewrite of almost every standard that refers to fire resistance. Okay. So 9991, for example, that series, they all allow 476 test evidence. So if that's removed from approved document B, that will need to be rewritten, or approved document B will have to allow for fire engineering solutions that do allow 476 testing.
Very interesting.
And there'll be an outcome that will, I guess, unravel as it gets reviewed. Mm-hmm. There is another question as well. How would BS 8214 still be relevant to door sets? Yes, that sort of adds on to the last question.
Well, it's relevant because it covers more than just testing. It covers installation, it covers a number of items. So at the moment, the testing requirement within 8412 talks about 476 or 1634 testing. Now that would be rewritten if 476 was removed from ADB to only reference 1634. So as an overall standard, it will still be relevant because it covers far more aspects than just the test standards.
It's good. Thank you, Russell.
Very good.
Apologies, we are running quite over time. Yeah. There's one thing I just wanted to ask Richard Kowalski. There's a question here on the third-party certification schemes, Richard. Someone's asking, you mentioned one of the schemes, are all the third-party certification schemes based on BS 476?
I can't answer all schemes, but it depends. Certainly the timber door element, I checked some of the iMongery elements, and a lot of the iMongery elements refer to 1634 already. Under certifier, all the certificates say 476, but something that was on one of the slides that may have been missed is regarding doing an assessment. You can assess 1634 down to 476, if we want to call it that, but you can't do it the opposite way. So if a customer has tested 5 tests to 1634 and 5 tests to 476, you would then put all those together and call them 476s, but you can't do it vice versa. You can't change the 476 into 1634 because of the slightly more onerous aspect of that. So it will be just a matter of, it won't make them irrelevant or redundant, whatever term you want to use. It will just mean that the documents will have to be rewritten in line with 1634. People may lose product, lose the scope, or lose a part of the scope. You will see a reduced scope from some suppliers until they've done all of those tests to get that scope back up to where it was under the 476. So there'll be no real loss, I don't think.
That's good. And Chris, what's the panel's overall opinion on whether the government will remove the national standard BS 476? When it goes out to consultation, is it pretty much set in stone, or how definite would it be?
I mean, this is a really hard one for the reasons I said before. It just depends on who is lobbying government, and what their impact will be on what. I mean, if we assume that the civil servants are pretty objective, they will put up the best case. Right. But whether that will get past the politicians is a whole new different ballgame.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And just we are ready to close, but I just wanted to speak about your plain guide to the.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll send you some details, but I did a plain guide to the building safety bill, And I've now got a plain guide Building Safety Act. And this just tries to put in one place the Act and the explanatory notes. What really bothers me about government and about the industry is the lack of diagrams.
Right.
It's all words. And for people who, you know, civil servants nearly all have humanities degrees. People in the sector quite often don't. And it's how we get that complex message across in simple terms.
Yeah, that's very good. Thank you.
Very good point.
We'll wrap up at that. Those are just some key takeaways. For property developers and contractors, we would strongly recommend taking a legal and professional advice on what lies ahead. The government are talking about massive increases in costs of fire safety products if this goes through. So, and assess what services you're currently getting that will be affected. Fire door manufacturers, again, it's really is recommended that you look at timescales and put in feedback in the consultation responses and look realistically at, I mean, the announcement was made on the 22nd of December. We had already set our testing and certification budget as a company for door closers in October and November. So a door manufacturer that's set their budget before 22nd December and then expected to retest in 12 months. And, you know, how long will it take and when will the funding be there to retest what needs retesting? Yeah, contractors look at long-term fixed price contracts. If costs are going to go up, there's been there's a tendency always to value engineer fire doors, which we don't agree with, and contractors winning contracts on price and then scurrying around trying to get door manufacturers to reduce their costs. Beware of long-term fixed price contracts, and end users, property owners, again, if fire doors are going to cost more in the future over the next 3-5 years, where's the budget? We can't have life safety stalled. So I think that's brings us to an end, and thank you again everyone for attending. Fantastic attendance, and we trust you've got some key takeaways. Thank you very much.